Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wednesday of Week 8 of Philosophy 201 Introduction to Philosophy. I am Dr. Patricia Gross, and I will be your professor today. Uh, this week, we are dealing with a very complex question. How do we know anything at all? And this is related to the questions from our previous weeks. However, I'd like you to consider this. What is the relationship between knowing and being known? And this kind of is reflected in your assignments for Monday, right? Where you have a representation of someone on social media, but then what you think you know about that person might differ from that representation. But is the person you know in your mind the same thing as the person themselves? And these are the kinds of questions that we're going to be thinking about in the coming weeks. This week's reading is not philosophy per se, it's a selection from a novel. The author Ralph Ellison lived from 1913 to 1994 and published his famous work, Invisible Man, in 1952. This book follows an unnamed narrator's journey from childhood to adulthood, from country to the city. The book begins with the statement, "I am an invisible man." What does this mean? There's a YouTube video by Course Hero I'd like you to watch to get a better understanding of this book in particular and its importance in the time period in which it was published, especially as it's a book that's written um, before the Civil Rights Act, right? So it's a very difficult time to be a black man in this particular time period in U.S. history, as if it's so much easier today. But it's very important to think about the history of our country and where we've come from and how that actually affects our philosophical thinking in some ways, but I digress. This book is not supernatural fiction. The narrator is invisible specifically because of the color of his skin, because he's a black man, and because of other reasons as well. But the citation that's on this paragraph is from the first page, right? And it describes to us the nature of his invisibility. He says, "Nor is my invisibility exactly a matter of biochemical accident to my epidermis." Epidermis means skin. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those with whom I come in contact. So his invisibility has to do with the other person's eyes, a matter of the construction of their inner eyes, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. So it's not that some magical thing about himself that makes him invisible. And it's not really the physical eyes of the other people, it's their inner eye, right? And I think he means here their mind's eye, the way that the people look, right? "I'm not complaining, nor am I protesting either," he writes. "It is something advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves." So advantageous, and often it's good to be unseen, but he says it's rather wearing on the nerves or wearing on the nerves, as in you might not know this expression, but to be wear on someone's nerves is something that's grating over and over and over again, right? It's like being in a room that has a clock that where the second hand is not quite right. So sometimes it's a second, sometimes it's half a second. When it clicks, it's unnerving, it's grating, right? It's not very comfortable. He says, then too, you're constantly being bumped against by those of poor vision, right? And again, this symmetry, excuse me, this symbolism of eyesight and not seeing and not being seen, right? The people with poor vision don't have physically poor vision, right? And the being bumped against isn't necessarily being bumped against physically. The bumping it occurs in a lot of different kinds of ways. He says, or again, you often doubt if you really exist. You wonder whether you aren't simply a phantom in other people's minds. So he's talking about being seen but not being seen, and he's wondering if he himself as a person really exists, right? And this imagery of the phantom comes up again in the same prologue. A phantom comes from the Greek phantasma, right? And a phantom is a ghost, basically, or a figment of someone's imagination is another description of it. A phantom is something that doesn't exist, right? It's like something in their minds. A phantom in someone's mind is something like something that they made up themselves, right? Just like the little child that says, there's a ghost under my bed or there's a monster under my bed. The monster is nothing but a phantom in the child's mind, right? The scene, so when we think about this bumping up against, right, there's an actual scene that involves a bumping that is relevant here. And so it's the scene in which, in the prologue and a couple pages later, or the next page, where the narrator is walking down the street and accidentally bumps into someone, right? And before he could really even say excuse me or anything, the blonde white man that he bumps into, says a rude word, which I imagine you might know what kind of rude words a blonde white man might say to a black man in 1952, right? And so this sort of drives the narrator over the edge a little, and he grabs the guy by the lapels of his coat, and he's starting to scream, apologize, you should apologize, apologize. And the guy just starts screaming more at him, right? And so the narrator starts hitting him, right? And so he says, in my outrage, I got out my knife and prepared to slit his throat. Right there beneath the lamplight in the deserted street, holding him by the collar with one hand, opening my knife with my teeth, when it occurred to me that the man had not seen me, actually. That he, as far as he knew, was in the midst of a walking nightmare. So he's about to kill this guy, and then he realizes that this guy who's been insulting him, who's been screaming, racial epithets at him, hadn't seen him. Well, did he see him? What does it mean to not be seen? He continues. And I stopped the blade slicing the air as I pushed him away, letting him fall back to the street. I stared at him hard as the lights of a car stabbed through the darkness. He lay there, moaning on the asphalt. A man almost killed by a phantom. Right? And remember, the phantom, as we know from earlier, is the thing that he was afraid of being, right? He's like in some ways wondering if he's just like some phantom dreamed up by other people because other people don't see him as a person, right? They're seeing him as this sort of representation of what they think he is because he is a black man. He writes, it unnerved me. I was both disgusted and ashamed. I was like a drunken man myself, wavering about on weakened legs. Then I was amused. Something in this man's thick head sprung out and beaten him within an inch of his life. I began to laugh at this crazy discovery. Would he have awakened at the point of death? Would death himself have freed him for wakeful living? So he starts laughing. So he's just sort of confronted with the absurdity of the situation, right? That this man, the reason that he's in the situation at all is because he didn't ever see the narrator as an individual, as a person. He just saw him as a black man and called him awful names because he's a black man, not because of who he was. Yeah, the narrator bumped into him, right? But the narrator bumped into him, not black man, right? A particular man bumped into him. But all the white man that's currently on the ground bleeding, almost dead, could think of was this image of a black man that was in his own mind. It's his own racism and own bias that jumped out in the night and almost killed him because he refused to see the man as a real man, right? And this absurdity makes the narrator laugh. And so I think that many of us have had times in our lives where we feel like we're not being seen, right? Where we feel like we're not known as who we are, or when we look at someone looking at us and we realize that they're not looking at us, they're looking at an image of us they've created in their mind. So this book, I think, troubles our notion of reality, or really it emphasizes the fact that our reality is often in our own minds. We do not often see each other, really, especially when our expectations do not allow us to consider reality in a really meaningful way. I bring this up, if you go online, you'll see these expectations versus reality, like I think I'm looking this cool, but actually I'm this cool. And you see that, and that was my little joke with Loki from last week, right? Or from the last time, right? Loki and Loki, right? You're expecting this and you come to this. And the thing is, your expectation and reality are not even necessarily the case, right? Like, this is our expectation, and we think this is the reality, but this might not even be the reality. How do we know what's really real, right? And so often, our vision in our own minds of what the world is around us is false, and can lead us astray, or lead us into bumping into people in a way that's harmful to them. So, your discussion board post for Wednesday is to write a one-page response to the Ellison reading. I would like one page of your response one paragraph of your response needs to answer the question: how does the reading relate to our class materials so far? Blah, that was hard to say. How does this reading relate to our class materials so far? One paragraph of your response must answer the question: how does this reading relate to online dating? One paragraph of your response must answer the question: have you ever been invisible, and why? At the end of this response, write 2 questions for your colleagues. Respond to 3 of your classmates' posts by 11:59 p.m. on Friday. Your original post is due at 11:59 p.m. on Wednesday. That's it for this week. Next week, we're moving on to Descartes, and we're continuing to question, how do we know our reality is real? Like, how do we know our perception is real? Okay. All right. I'm looking forward to hearing from you this week. Goodbye. Wait, wrong button. Goodbye.